There was a man named George who lived in a small village. He was a farmer and worked hard on his fields, growing rice. George had a son named Johnson. His wife had passed away when Johnson was only 4 years old. Johnson had been very close to his mother, and after she died, he became stubborn. He would cry if his father didn't fulfill his wishes. To avoid hearing his son cry, George always gave him what he wanted. This made Johnson even more stubborn. He lost interest in school. Instead, he enjoyed sleeping and spending time with his friends. George worried about his son's future. Johnson kept getting poor grades, and for 3 years, he failed his college exams. George didn't know what to do. One day, Johnson came to George and said,
"Dad, Mike and Jack are going shopping, and I need clothes and shoes too. Please give me money."
George looked at him.
"But son, you already have plenty of clothes. Why spend more money?"
Johnson replied,
"But, Dad, I need to go with them. I want to shop, that's all."
George sighed.
"Okay. My son, you are the most important to me."
Early in the morning, George woke up and went to the kitchen. He made tea and toasted some slices of bread. Then, he made an omelet. He peeled bananas and made a milkshake.
"Johnson will like this."
He set everything on the table, then went to Johnson's bedroom and called,
"Wake up, my dear. You are getting late for college. Breakfast is ready."
But Johnson didn't move. Not even a little.
"Please, wake up."
George urged him, feeling worried. Johnson barely opened one eye and said,
"Dad, I have a headache. I need some rest."
George went back to the kitchen sadly. George sat down for breakfast, staring at the food. He sighed.
"Johnson always makes excuses. Maybe it's my fault. After Ella's death, I fulfilled all his wishes, and now he's stubborn. If I had been strict, maybe he would have been sensible."
George tried to swallow the toast with omelet. He didn't even touch the milkshake. Then he left for work. George arrived in the field and checked the rice crops. They were growing well, nearly ready for harvest. He noticed some weeds.
"Robert, pull out those weeds. Didn't you see them?"
He scolded.
Daniel! Water the crops properly.
He then called.
James! Add the fertilizer to the crops. Don't forget the corners.
Meanwhile, Adam, George's best friend, arrived.
Hi, George. How are you?
He greeted.
Fine. Come here.
George replied, leading him to a shed. Adam noticed George's tense face.
Any problem?
He asked. George sighed.
John skipped college again today.
Adam smiled.
If he were my son, I would teach him a lesson. Now tell me, how is everything going? Do you need my help?
George replied.
No. My dear. All is well.
That night at dinner, George said,
You are always sleeping or out with friends. You have been failing your exams for the last 3 years. You need to complete your studies now.
A few days later, Johnson said,
Dad, I need a new bike. This one is old now.
George said,
Harvesting is near, and I need extra servants. I can't give it to you now, but after the crops are sold, I will get it for you.
Johnson shouted.
I want it now! If Mom were alive, you wouldn't treat me like this.
George felt a pang in his heart. After all the efforts he made to raise him, Johnson didn't realize it.
All right. I will get it for you. Don't worry.
George said softly. Johnson went to his room. George sat there, feeling a deep sadness. His heart heavy with disappointment. Johnson's exams started. But George felt no hope. He still ensured Johnson had a proper diet, making sure he was well fed during the exams. The exams ended, and Johnson was once again busy with his friends. The results were announced, and Johnson failed all his subjects. George asked,
What's the result?
Johnson lowered his gaze, shame on his face.
Dad, I failed.
He said softly. George sighed. He knew it before.
I don't want to continue my studies now.
Johnson added. George replied,
I agree with you.
though his heart broke. Johnson was his only son, and he had always dreamed of giving him the best education. A few days later, George entered Johnson's room at night.
From tomorrow, You are going with me to the field. Wake up on time. You should learn farming now.
The next morning, George woke up Johnson.
Get up. Breakfast is ready,
he said. After eating, they headed to the fields.
See these crops?
George asked.
They are almost ready. Water them early in the morning and late in the evening. Keep the weeds clear, or they will steal nutrients.
Johnson nodded.
Check for pests, too.
George added.
Healthy crops need care every day.
The next day, George noticed Johnson still wasn't interested. The next morning, George went to wake up Johnson.
Johnson, wake up.
Johnson groggily replied.
I'm tired, Dad.
George shook his head. This happened often. Johnson would sleep, ignoring his father's calls. One day, George walked to the shed and found Johnson asleep on the ground. He shook him.
Johnson, wake up. It's work time.
Johnson rubbed his eyes.
I'm just tired, Dad.
George frowned.
Tired? Get up and help me.
On Sunday, the postman delivered a letter. George opened it and read.
Dear George, my son Louis's wedding is on Monday. Please come.
George sighed.
Louis is the same age as Johnson, but he's getting married.
The next day, George visited Adam. George said,
My brother's son, Louis, is getting married, but Johnson is still childish.
Adam thought for a moment, then said,
I have a plan.
He told the plan. George listened and liked it. On Sunday, George packed his things and told Johnson,
If you need money, ask Uncle Adam, but give him $100 first.
and left. Johnson was surprised. Feeling hungry, he went to the kitchen. And he discovered that tea and bread were only enough for 3 days.
How will I manage?
He asked Mike for help, but Mike had no money left. Then, he went to John, but John said the same.
I should do some work for $100.
George thought. Johnson went to a store and said,
Sir, I want to work as a salesman.
The owner replied.
No need right now.
He then went to a factory, entered the office, and said,
I want to work as a helper. I will do any work.
The manager replied.
Sorry. We have no openings.
That evening, he returned home, tired. The next day, after tea and bread, Johnson went job hunting. He saw a construction site and asked the contractor for work as a helper. The contractor agreed.
Supply material to the workers on the first floor.
Johnson started, but after some time, slipped the material. The contractor shouted,
How dare you! Leave now!
Johnson, scared, quickly left. The next morning, Johnson saw a road construction site and got a helper job, working hard all day. Sweating and tired from the hard work, he earned $100. He gave $100 to Uncle Adam, who smiled and asked,
What do you need?
Johnson replied,
I need $700.
Adam gave it to him. He went to grocery store happily. But at the grocery store, Johnson thought,
My dad worked so hard for this. How can I waste it?
Tears came into his eyes. He bought only what was needed. And he decided to work with his dad from then on. Moral: hard work earns respect and appreciation, and wasting others' efforts brings regret.